While every settler in Haywood County built proper timber cabins with peaked roofs and plank walls, 17-year-old Elias Thornwood was piling dirt and straw over a wooden frame dug into the hillside. His neighbors called it primitive madness. They called him a fool. The boy constructed a dome-shaped earth shelter that rose from the ground like a giant molehill, its curved walls packed with 3 feet of soil and covered with thick layers of straw and thatch. He spent 6 weeks moving over 12,000 pounds of earth by hand, working from dawn until his palms bled and his back screamed for mercy. Beside him, through every hour of that back-breaking labor, sat a 4-year-old Icelandic sheepdog named Odin. The dog watched his master dig with patient amber eyes, occasionally bringing a leather water pouch tied around his neck when Elias paused to wipe sweat from his brow. Silas Hendricks, the settlement's most experienced builder, who had constructed 58 cabins across 4 counties in 32 years, laughed openly watching Elias work. "Boy's building himself a grave before he's even dead," Silas announced loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "That dirt pile will collapse first heavy snow that lands on it, and he'll be buried alive in his own foolishness." Odin growled softly at the older man, positioning himself between Silas and his young master. Elias said nothing. He simply adjusted his grip on the shovel and continued digging. But to understand why this orphan teenager chose to build what everyone called a grave, you need to know what he had lost and what he had inherited. 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1891, 14-year-old Elias Thornwood watched his mother Astrid take her final breath. The fever had come without warning, as fevers often did in the mountain communities of North Carolina. One morning, Astrid was hanging laundry and humming an old Icelandic lullaby. 3 days later, she was gone. Elias remembered the exact moment, the way her hand went slack in his, the sudden absence of her labored breathing, the terrible silence that followed. His father, William, a timberman who had married the Icelandic immigrant woman against his family's wishes, aged 10 years in that single week. The light went out of his eyes and it never fully returned, but help came from across the ocean. Eric Thornwood, Astrid's father, arrived from Iceland 2 months after his daughter's death. He was 71 years old, weathered by decades of North Atlantic winters, and he carried 2 things that would change young Elias's life forever. The first was a 3-month-old Icelandic sheepdog puppy with fur the color of storm clouds. "His name is Odin," the old man said in his heavily accented English, placing the wiggling puppy in his grandson's arms. "In Iceland, we believe dogs carry pieces of our ancestors' souls. Your mother loved this breed. Now a piece of her watches over you." The second thing Eric carried was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with 200 years of handwritten notes in a mixture of Icelandic and English. "This," Eric said, pressing the worn book into Elias's hands, "is more valuable than gold, more valuable than land. This is how our people survived winters that would kill any man who built with wood alone." For the next 3 years, Eric taught his grandson everything the journal contained. They would sit by the fire on winter nights, the old man's gnarled finger tracing diagrams of structures that looked nothing like the cabins dotting the American frontier. "Turf houses," Eric explained. "For 1,000 years our ancestors built into the earth, not above it. While other men froze in their wooden boxes, Icelanders slept warm beneath blankets of soil." He taught Elias about thermal mass, about how Earth absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, maintaining stable temperatures regardless of what chaos the weather brought outside. About how a dome shape eliminates corners where cold air accumulates and provides maximum interior volume with minimum surface area. "The Earth itself holds warmth better than any timber wall ever could," Eric would say, his eyes distant with memories of his homeland. "We are not fighting the weather. We are hiding from it inside the mountain itself." Elias absorbed every word, every diagram, every principle, but he never imagined he would need to use this knowledge so soon. March of 1894 brought the second tragedy. William Thornwood was working a logging site 12 miles from home when a massive oak, its core rotted hollow by disease, split without warning during the felling of an adjacent tree. The oak fell sideways instead of forward, and William never had a chance to run. They brought his body home on a wagon, covered with a canvas tarp that couldn't quite hide the unnatural angles beneath. Elias was 17 years old, an orphan. But the cruelest blow came 2 weeks later. Eric Thornwood, who had survived 7 decades of Icelandic winters and crossed an ocean to care for his grandson, collapsed beside the fireplace while reading from his precious journal. His heart, weakened by age and grief, simply stopped. Elias held the old man's hand as he passed, just as he had held his mother's hand 3 years before. Odin lay across Eric's feet, whimpering softly. With his final breath, Eric whispered words that Elias would carry for the rest of his life. Build like our ancestors, boy. The earth will save you when wood betrays everyone else. Read the journal, trust what I taught you, and take care of Odin. He will take care of you. Then Eric Thornwood closed his eyes and joined his daughter in whatever peace awaited beyond. Elias was now truly alone in the world. 17 years old, owner of 40 acres of mountain land, guardian of a 4-year-old dog, and keeper of a 200-year-old journal written in a language most Americans couldn't read. The community expected him to sell the land and seek apprenticeship in Asheville. A boy his age had no business trying to homestead alone. Everyone said so. Everyone, that is, except Elias himself. If you were Elias, 17 years old, orphaned 3 times in 3 years, holding nothing but a journal of ancient knowledge and a loyal dog, what would you do? Would you sell everything and walk away from your family's land? Or would you bet your life on wisdom that everyone around you would call madness? Think about that for a moment, because what Elias chose to do next would save 31 lives. August of 1894 brought the confrontation that would define everything that followed. Silas Hendricks rode up to the Thornwood property on a Tuesday morning, his horse's hooves kicking up dust from the summer dry trail. The older man had a proposition, and he expected the orphan boy to accept it gratefully. "I'll give you $800 for the 40 acres, Silas announced, not bothering to dismount. "That's fair money, more than fair, considering there's nothing on this land but a falling-down cabin and a heap of memories." Elias stood on the porch of his father's cabin, Odin sitting alert at his feet. The boy's face showed nothing. His voice came out flat and certain. "The land is not for sale." Silas laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Boy, you can't work this land alone. You've got no family, no wife, no prospects. What are you going to do? Live in that rotting cabin until it collapses on your head?" "I am going to build a new home." "With what money? What skills?" Silas shook his head with the confidence of a man who had been right about everything for 32 years. "I'm offering you a chance at a real life. Take the money, learn a trade in town, find a wife. Don't waste your youth on 40 acres of nothing." Elias reached into his shirt and withdrew the leather journal. He held it up so Silas could see the worn cover. The pages yellowed with age. "My grandfather survived winters in Iceland that would kill every person in this county," Elias said quietly. "He taught me how to build homes that hold warmth when wooden cabins become coffins. I am going to build one of those homes. Here, on my land." Silas stared at the boy for a long moment. Then he started to laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard the most ridiculous thing imaginable and wants everyone within earshot to share in the joke. "An earth house?" Silas managed between guffaws. "You're going to dig a hole in the ground and live in it like a badger?" He turned in his saddle to address the 2 farmhands who had accompanied him. "You hear that, boys? The Thornwood orphan thinks he's going to build himself a dirt cave and survive a Carolina winter." The farmhands laughed dutifully, though with less conviction than their employer. Silas turned back to Elias, his amusement hardening into something closer to contempt. "Boy, I've built 58 cabins in these mountains. I've kept families alive through winters that killed livestock standing in their barns. And you, a 17-year-old orphan with no experience and no sense, think you know better than everyone who came before you?" Elias said nothing. He simply tucked the journal back into his shirt. "Fine," Silas spat. "Build your dirt pile. When it collapses in the first snow, don't come crying to me for help." He wheeled his horse around, then paused to deliver one final judgment. "Boy's building himself a grave before he's even dead," he announced to no one in particular. "Mark my words, that dirt pile will be his tomb." Odin growled as the riders departed, his hackles raised in instinctive defense of his master. Elias knelt and placed a calming hand on the dog's head. "Let them laugh," he said softly. "Grandfather said the ones who laugh loudest in summer often cry loudest in winter." The next morning, Elias began to dig. The excavation took 6 weeks of brutal labor. Elias worked alone, as he had known he would. Word of his project had spread through the settlement within days, and Silas Hendricks had made his position clear to everyone. "Don't help the boy," Silas told the community at the Sunday gathering. "He needs to learn that the old ways died for good reason. Let him fail. Let him come crawling back to civilization when his cave fills with water and rats." So Elias dug without assistance. The mountain soil yielded slowly to his blade, heavy clay mixed with stone that had to be loosened with a pickaxe before the shovel could move it. Day after day, wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow. His hands blistered. The blisters broke. The broken skin hardened into calluses that cracked and bled. He wrapped his palms in strips of cloth and kept digging. Odin stayed with him through every hour. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening, and he appointed himself guardian of the excavation site. He would sit at the edge of the pit, watching Elias work, and whenever a visitor approached, Odin would alert his master with a soft bark. The visitors came frequently. Silas Hendricks appeared on the third day, standing at the edge of the excavation with his arms crossed and his expression caught between amusement and disgust. "That's the damnedest thing I've seen in 32 years of mountain building," Silas called down. "You're digging yourself a pit when you should be raising walls. A man builds up from the ground, not down into it like some burrowing animal." Elias didn't look up from his digging. "My grandfather built this way in Iceland. Turf houses, he called them. Said the old Norse settlers survived winters that would kill any man in a wooden box." Silas shook his head and walked away, but not before muttering loud enough to be heard. "Foolishness, pure foolishness." Robert Whitmore, the region's surveyor and self-appointed authority on proper construction, arrived on the 10th day with a notebook and a measuring tape. He spent an hour examining the excavation, taking notes, and shaking his head with increasing frequency. "The structural integrity is questionable at best," Whitmore announced when he finished his assessment. "Underground dwellings invite dampness, vermin, and the kind of close air that breeds consumption and fever. I'll be filing a report with the county expressing my concerns about the safety of this project." Elias continued digging. Whitmore continued taking notes. Neither man changed the other's mind. Reverend Josiah Caldwell came on the 18th day, his worn Bible tucked under his arm and genuine concern creasing his weathered face. The minister had baptized Elias as an infant and had presided over the funerals of his mother, father, and grandfather. He felt a responsibility for the boy's spiritual welfare. "Son," Caldwell said gently, kneeling at the edge of the pit, "I understand you're grieving. Losing your whole family in such a short time would test any man's faith. But this," he gestured at the excavation, "this isn't the answer. This dwelling, it speaks of pagan traditions, of ways that civilized Christian folk abandoned long ago." Elias paused in his digging and looked up at the minister. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes were calm. "With respect, Reverend, my grandfather was a Christian man. He read his Bible every night. He also built turf houses because God gave him the wisdom to use the earth he created. I don't see any conflict in that." Caldwell had no response. He blessed the boy, promised to pray for him, and departed with a troubled heart. Dr. Franklin Holloway visited on the 25th day, bringing medical concerns that he presented with clinical detachment. "The sanitary implications are serious," the doctor explained. "Subterranean living spaces lack proper ventilation. Moisture accumulates. Mold grows. Disease follows. I've seen it happen in mining communities. You'll develop lung ailments within 2 years if you live in that hole." Elias pointed to the ventilation channels he had already incorporated into the design. "Air enters here, low. Stale air exits there, high. Continuous circulation without heat loss." Holloway examined the channels, frowned, and admitted he had never seen such a design. He still predicted disaster, but his certainty seemed slightly shaken as he walked away. Margaret Dahl, a wealthy widow who considered herself the social arbiter of the settlement, didn't bother visiting the site. She simply spread rumors from the comfort of her parlor. "Poor thing has lost his mind," Margaret told anyone who would listen. 3 deaths in 3 years would break anyone. He's out there digging his own grave because he can't face living without his family. Someone really should intervene." Billy Tanner, a 22-year-old farmhand with more confidence than sense, visited on the 30th day with 3 friends and a bottle of whiskey. $5 says that dirt pile falls down before Christmas, Billy shouted, raising the bottle in a mocking toast. Who wants to bet against the crazy orphan? His friends laughed and took the bet. Billy threw an empty bottle toward the excavation site, missing Elias by several feet. Odin barked furiously, his protective instincts fully triggered. Elias had to physically restrain the dog from charging at the drunken visitors. Easy, boy, Elias whispered, holding Odin's collar. They're not worth your teeth. The young men stumbled away, laughing, leaving broken glass scattered across the ground that Elias would have to carefully remove the next morning. Have you ever known something that others refuse to believe? Have you ever watched people march toward danger while mocking the very knowledge that could save them? That is exactly what Elias Thornwood experienced in the autumn of 1894. And it is a feeling that many of you watching this story probably understand all too well. But not everyone came to mock. Klaus Weber appeared on the 22nd day. The 62-year-old German immigrant had settled in Haywood County in 1889, and he had never quite fit in with the American-born residents. His English was heavily accented, his customs were different, and his suggestions about farming and building were routinely dismissed as old country nonsense. But Klaus Weber had seen something in Elias's excavation that the others had missed. He stood at the edge of the pit for a long time, his wrinkled face showing none of the mockery that had characterized every other visitor. Instead, his expression held something closer to recognition. Erdhaus, Weber said finally, using the German word for earth house. My grandfather in Bavaria built like this, before the timber was plenty, before everyone forgot the old ways. Elias looked up, surprised to hear understanding instead of ridicule. You know this technique? Weber nodded slowly. The boy builds like the old people before timber was plenty. Thermal mass, earth insulation. The physics make sense, even if the frontier context seems to favor different methods. He glanced over his shoulder, checking if anyone was watching. Then he leaned down and spoke quietly. Don't let them break you, young man. The old ways survive for reasons. The new ways, sometimes they are better. Sometimes they just seem better because people forget what their grandparents knew. Weber pressed a small package into Elias's hands. Dried sausage and dark bread. Food that would keep a working man's strength up. I am too old to help you dig, Weber said, but I can feed you, and I can tell you that you are not crazy. You are remembering what everyone else has forgotten. It was the first encouragement Elias had received since his grandfather's death. Old Jacob Morrison appeared on the final day of excavation. At 70 years old, Morrison was one of the oldest residents of Haywood County and one of the few who remembered the brutal winter of 1856. That winter had killed 28 people across the Blue Ridge Mountains, freezing them in their cabins, catching them in blizzards, claiming them one by one as the cold stretched on week after week. Morrison had survived because a Cherokee family had found him delirious in the snow and taken him to their earth-sheltered lodge. He had spent 3 weeks underground, warm and safe, while the world above turned into a frozen hell. He had never forgotten. Morrison circled Elias's completed excavation 3 times, examining the curved walls, the drainage channels, the ventilation system. His gnarled hands traced the contours of the earth with the gentle touch of someone greeting an old friend. This is it, Morrison said finally, his voice rough with age and memory. This is what saved my life in '56. Elias stopped his work and gave the old man his full attention. You have seen structures like this before? Morrison nodded. The Cherokee built into hillsides, earth walls 2 feet thick. I laughed at them too, before that winter, called their lodges primitive, savage. He paused, his eyes distant. Then the cold came, and their primitive savage lodge was the only thing standing between me and death. I never laughed at the old ways again. He turned to face Elias directly, his expression grave. Weather's got that feel, boy. Same kind of pressure drop, same stillness before the wind. We had cold like that before the killing winter of '56. He gestured at the Earth Dome taking shape. If we get another freeze like that one, your dirt house might be the difference between living and dying for more folks than just yourself. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. You truly think another killing winter is coming? Morrison looked at the sky, at the trees, at the birds already flying south earlier than usual. I know it is, he said quietly. Question is whether anyone will listen before it's too late. His warnings fell on deaf ears. Pride makes people blind to danger they have never faced. But there was one more person who saw what the others missed. Her name was Ingrid Lindqvist, and she was 20 years old, the daughter of a Swedish carpenter who had settled in Haywood County 5 years earlier. Ingrid had her father's practical mind and her late mother's curiosity, a combination that made her different from most young women in the settlement. While others came to mock Elias's project, Ingrid came to observe. She first appeared in late September, watching from the tree line as Elias worked on the framework of bent saplings that would support the earth covering. She didn't announce herself. She simply stood among the pines, silent and watchful, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light. Odin noticed her before Elias did. The dog's ears perked up, and he let out a soft woof of greeting rather than the warning bark he reserved for hostile visitors. Elias turned and saw the young woman watching him. He expected mockery. He braced for it. Instead, Ingrid walked forward and examined the sapling framework with genuine interest. My father worked on a church in Stockholm that had curved ceilings, she said, her voice carrying a slight Scandinavian accent. The architect said curves are stronger than straight lines. Is that why you chose this shape? Elias blinked. It was the first intelligent question anyone had asked about his design. Partially, he admitted. The dome also eliminates corners where cold air can pool, and it provides maximum interior volume with minimum surface area. Less surface means less heat loss. Ingrid nodded as if this made perfect sense. May I see the drawings? Elias hesitated. The journal was his most precious possession, the last tangible connection to his grandfather. He had never shown it to anyone. But something about this young woman's sincere curiosity broke through his defenses. He retrieved the journal from his cabin and opened it to the pages showing turf house construction. Ingrid studied the diagrams with focused attention, asking questions that proved she actually understood what she was looking at. This ventilation system, she said, pointing to a sketch. Hot air rises and exits here, pulling fresh, cold air in through the lower channel. The fresh air is warmed by passing near the fire before it circulates through the living space. It's like a breathing system for the house. Elias stared at her. You understood that from a single diagram? Ingrid smiled slightly. My mother taught me to read before she taught me to cook. She said a woman who cannot think for herself will spend her life thinking whatever others tell her to think. From that day forward, Ingrid found reasons to visit the construction site. She brought food. She brought questions. She brought the simple gift of treating Elias like a rational human being rather than a madman. One October evening, she found a page from the journal that had blown loose in the wind. She read it carefully before returning it to Elias. This isn't madness, she said quietly. This is science. Very old science, but science nonetheless. Why won't they see that? Because it's easier to laugh than to think, Elias replied. Because admitting I might be right means admitting they might be wrong, and people would rather die comfortable in their certainty than live having admitted a mistake. Ingrid looked at him for a long moment. I believe you, she said simply. I don't know if your earth house will work exactly as you hope, but I believe you have reasons for everything you're doing, and I believe those reasons deserve respect instead of mockery. Odin chose that moment to approach Ingrid and rest his head against her knee. The dog had excellent instincts about people. Elias felt something shift in his chest, something that had been frozen since his grandfather's death began, very slowly to thaw. Word of Ingrid's visits reached her father within days. Eric Lindqvist was a practical man who wanted his daughter to marry well, and a penniless orphan living in a dirt mound did not fit his definition of a suitable match. But it was Silas Hendricks who forced the confrontation. Your daughter has been spending time with the Thornwood boy, Silas told Eric at the general store, loud enough for others to hear. Visiting his dirt cave, bringing him food. People are starting to talk. Eric Lindqvist's face darkened. That evening, he forbade Ingrid from any further contact with Elias. That boy is touched in the head, Eric said firmly. I will not have my daughter associated with madness. You will stay away from him and his foolish earth pile. Ingrid said nothing, but the next morning she found a different path through the woods, one that her father could not see, one that led to a young man who understood things that everyone else had forgotten. She would not abandon the only person in the settlement who treated her curiosity as a gift rather than a flaw, even if it meant defying her father, even if it meant risking everything. November brought completion of the Earth Dome and the first serious test of its design. The structure rose from the hillside like a grass-covered mound, its entrance facing south to capture winter sunlight, its curved walls packed with 3 feet of insulating earth. Inside, the air was cool but not cold, the walls smooth and dry, the atmosphere nothing like the damp cave that Robert Whitmore had predicted. Silas Hendricks organized what he called a tour of inspection 3 days after Elias moved in. He brought half the settlement to see the boy's folly, confident that public ridicule would finally break the orphan's stubborn spirit. 30 people gathered around the Earth Dome that November morning. They pointed. They laughed. They made jokes about badgers and groundhogs and grave plots. Elias stood before his home with Odin at his side. His face showed nothing. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried no anger. "You will see." 3 words. That was all he said before turning and walking back into his Earth Dome, leaving the crowd to their amusement. But the early November cold snaps provided a different kind of answer. A week of temperatures dropping to 15 degrees below zero descended on Haywood County with brutal efficiency. Silas Hendricks' timber cabin, constructed according to his 32 years of frontier experience, required constant fire maintenance to keep interior temperatures above 40 degrees. His family huddled near the hearth, wrapped in blankets, feeding the fire every hour through the night. Robert Whitmore faced the same struggle. His precise construction, tight joints, quality chinking, properly sized fireplace, all required continuous burning to maintain livable temperatures. Frost formed on the interior walls of his cabin by morning. 300 yards across the clearing, Elias Thornwood's Earth Dome maintained 65 degrees with a modest fire that consumed half the fuel his neighbors were burning. Ingrid visited during this cold snap and experienced the difference firsthand. She stepped through the Earth Dome's entrance and stopped in amazement. Outside, the temperature was 10 below zero. Inside, Elias sat reading by a small fire, comfortable in his shirt sleeves. "How is this possible?" Ingrid asked, her breath visible for only a moment before the warm air dispersed the vapor. Elias gestured at the curved walls. "Touch them." Ingrid placed her palm against the packed earth. The surface was cool but not cold, completely dry, nothing like the frost-coated timbers of conventional cabins. "The earth stores heat," Elias explained. "My fire warms the air. The air warms the walls. The walls store that warmth in thousands of pounds of soil. When the fire dies down, the walls slowly release their stored heat back into the living space. In a timber cabin, all your heat goes straight through the walls and disappears. Here, the earth holds it, releases it slowly. I can let my fire die for 8 hours and still wake up warm." Ingrid looked at him with something that might have been wonder. "And they call this foolishness. They call it foolishness because it's different, because it's old, because a 17-year-old orphan built it instead of an expert with 32 years of experience." Elias shrugged. "Their opinions don't change physics." Word of the Earth Dome's performance spread through the settlement despite efforts to suppress it. Klaus Weber reported what Ingrid had described. Old Jacob Morrison nodded knowingly and repeated his warnings about the coming winter. A few younger settlers began asking questions about the construction technique. Silas Hendricks responded by organizing a community meeting. The meeting took place in the settlement's small church on the first Sunday of December. Silas had called for a vote to declare Elias's Earth Dome unsafe for human habitation, a designation that would legally require its demolition. "The structure represents a hazard to public safety," Silas announced from the front of the church. "It could collapse at any time. It attracts vermin. It promotes disease. As a community leader with 32 years of building experience, I am recommending that we order its removal before someone gets hurt." Robert Whitmore rose to support the motion. "I've examined the structure personally. The engineering is questionable. The sanitary conditions are concerning. My professional opinion is that this dwelling should not be occupied." Dr. Franklin Holloway added his medical concerns. Reverend Caldwell expressed spiritual reservations. Margaret Dahl spoke tearfully about the poor disturbed orphan who clearly needed intervention for his own good. The vote seemed certain. The crowd was nodding along with each speaker, ready to tear down the strange earth mound and force its stubborn builder into proper housing. Then old Jacob Morrison stood up. The church fell silent. Morrison rarely spoke at community gatherings. When he did, people listened, because he had survived things most of them couldn't imagine. In the winter of 1856, Morrison began, his gravelly voice carrying to every corner of the small church. 28 people died in these mountains, froze to death in their timber cabins, froze to death trying to reach their timber cabins. The cold killed anyone who trusted wood to protect them. He paused, letting the memory settle over the congregation. I should have been one of those 28. I was lost in a blizzard, half dead from exposure, when a Cherokee family found me. They took me to their shelter. And do you know what that shelter was? No one answered. A hole in a hillside, packed earth walls, a mound of dirt with a door, exactly like what that boy has built. Morrison pointed toward the church doors, toward the distant earth dome beyond. I lived in that dirt house for 3 weeks while the world above turned to ice. And I was warm. I survived. The Cherokee called it earth wisdom. They said the old ways knew things that the new ways had forgotten. He looked around the congregation, meeting eyes with Silas Hendricks. Now I've been watching the sky, watching the animals, watching the signs. And I'm telling you the same thing I've been telling everyone for months. This winter's going to be bad, killing bad, like 56 or worse. His voice rose. And when the cold comes, when your timber cabins can't hold heat, when you're burning your furniture and still freezing, that boy's earth dome might be the only thing in this county that can keep people alive. Silence gripped the church. I'm not asking you to believe me, Morrison continued. I'm asking you to wait. Wait until spring. See how the winter goes. If I'm wrong, you can tear down his dirt pile in March. But if I'm right, he shook his head slowly. If I'm right, you're going to be glad that Earth Dome is standing. The vote came down to 15 against demolition, 8 in favor. Morrison had swayed just enough of the congregation with his warning. Elias's Earth Dome would stand, but the mockery continued unabated. December passed. Christmas came and went. Billy Tanner collected his $5 when the Earth Dome didn't collapse, but he simply doubled his bet for January. $50 says the orphan freezes before February, Billy announced at the New Year's celebration. Who wants easy money? The new year arrived cold, but not exceptionally so. January's first week passed without incident. The skeptics grew more confident. Then the signs began. Old Jacob Morrison noticed first. The barometric pressure dropping faster than any storm he had experienced. Birds flying south in confused masses. Weeks later than their normal migration. Deer moving to lower elevations, despite the relatively mild temperatures. And a stillness in the air, a heaviness that Morrison had felt only once before in his 70 years. It's coming, he told anyone who would listen. It's coming, and it's going to be worse than 56. No one listened. January 15th, 1895 arrived with a silence that experienced mountain people recognized as deadly. The morning temperature read 22 degrees below zero on Silas Hendricks's mercury thermometer. By noon, it had dropped another 8 degrees despite pale winter sunshine. The air felt thick, heavy, waiting. Odin refused to leave the Earth Dome. The dog, who normally bounded outside at first light, stood at the entrance and whimpered, his amber eyes fixed on the sky. I know, boy, Elias said quietly, stroking the dog's thick fur. Something bad is coming. By nightfall, the great Arctic outbreak had begun its assault on the Blue Ridge Mountains. The cold came down from Canada like a living thing, a wall of frozen air that swept across the Great Plains and crashed into the Appalachian peaks with merciless force. Temperatures plunged to 35 degrees below zero in the first 12 hours, then 40 below, then 41. Wind accompanied the cold, steady at 40 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 70. The wind drove the cold through every crack and gap with the persistence of flowing water, finding weaknesses in construction that had been invisible during normal winters. The combination of temperature and wind created conditions that frontier builders had never anticipated. Wind chill calculations would later estimate the effective temperature at 70 degrees below zero. At that level, exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Frostbite can claim fingers and toes in the time it takes to walk 50 feet. Timber cabins designed for typical Carolina winters became death traps. Wood conducts cold. Every timber wall in Haywood County became a highway for frigid air, pulling heat from interior spaces faster than any fire could replace it. Gaps in chinking that had been unnoticeable during autumn became rivers of icy wind. Frost formed on interior walls, then ice, then thick crystals that glittered in firelight while families shivered nearby. Silas Hendricks, master builder, experienced the failure of his expertise within 48 hours. His cabin, constructed according to 32 years of knowledge, couldn't maintain temperatures above 25 degrees despite continuous fire. He burned through a cord of firewood the first day, then another cord. His carefully prepared winter fuel supply began disappearing at a rate that would leave his family without heat by early February. "Feed the fire," he ordered his wife, Catherine. "Keep it burning." "We're already burning everything we have," Catherine replied, her voice tight with fear. "If this cold continues, we'll have nothing left by month's end." Their 4 children huddled near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. The youngest 7-year-old Emma had stopped talking. The cold seemed to have frozen her voice along with her fingers. Robert Whitmore faced identical mechanical failures. His surveyor's cabin, precise in its construction, proved incapable of holding heat against temperatures his experience had never prepared him for. The tight joints he had prided himself on meant nothing when the cold exceeded every parameter his knowledge encompassed. Dr. Franklin Holloway discovered that his medical training had not prepared him for 60 below wind chill. His cabin dropped to freezing despite burning every piece of fuel he possessed. He began tearing medical texts from their bindings and feeding them to the flames, watching years of accumulated knowledge turn to ash in a desperate attempt to survive. Even Reverend Caldwell, whose faith had sustained him through countless trials, found himself questioning whether dawn would bring deliverance or death. The cold was simply too extreme, too relentless, too unprecedented. The deaths began on the 4th day. The Henderson family lived in a small cabin at the edge of the settlement. They had an 8-month-old baby, their first child, and they had spent the autumn months planning for the future. New fields to clear in spring, a second room to add to their cabin, dreams of the family they would build together. The cold killed those dreams along with their child. The Henderson baby stopped crying on the morning of January 18th. The parents had done everything possible, held the infant against their skin, wrapped blankets around all 3 of them, burned every piece of furniture in the cabin, fed the fire until they had nothing left to feed it. None of it was enough. The cabin's temperature dropped to 32 degrees by midnight, then 28 by dawn. The baby's tiny body simply couldn't maintain warmth against that assault. Martha Henderson found her child cold and still in her arms as the first light of the 5th day crept through the frost-covered window. Her scream of grief pierced the howling wind, carrying across the settlement, audible even to families huddled in their own failing cabins. It would not be the last such scream. Samuel Crawford died on the 6th day. At 78 years old, Crawford had survived more winters than anyone else in the settlement, but he lived alone, and he had been too proud to stockpile the massive fuel supplies that younger families maintained. His firewood ran out on January 20th. Too weak to venture out in search of more fuel, Crawford wrapped himself in blankets and sat in his chair beside the dead fireplace. The cold found him there, crept through his bones, slowed his heart, and finally stopped it completely. They found him 3 days later, sitting upright in his chair, his eyes open and frost-covered, frozen solid like a statue carved from ice. His expression held no fear, only a kind of tired acceptance. The Williams family lost 2 members within hours of each other. Grandmother Williams was 81 years old, and her 4-year-old grandson Thomas had been staying with her while his parents helped neighbors reinforce their cabin. When the storm's intensity made travel impossible, the boy was trapped with his grandmother in her tiny dwelling. Grandmother Williams gave the boy every blanket. She fed the fire until the last stick was gone. She held young Thomas against her chest, sharing what little body heat she had left, singing old hymns in a voice that grew weaker with each passing hour. They found them wrapped in each other's arms, the grandmother's final act having been to shield the boy with her own body. Neither had survived, but the grandmother's frozen face still held the expression of a woman who had done everything possible to save a child she loved. 67 people would die across 4 counties before the storm ended. 67 souls lost to cold that no timber cabin could withstand. But in one small earth dome, carved into a hillside by a boy everyone called a fool, 31 people would survive, and one new life would begin. Sometimes the difference between tragedy and miracle is nothing more than listening to the right person at the right time. 4 families, 4 deaths, and the cold showed no sign of relenting. Across the settlement, panic began to replace denial. Silas Hendricks watched his children turn blue near a fire that couldn't warm them. Robert Whitmore calculated fuel consumption rates and realized his family had days at most. Dr. Holloway, the man of science, found himself praying for the first time in years. And 300 yards away, in an earth dome that everyone had mocked as a grave, Elias Thornwood sat reading by a modest fire while Odin dozed on a warm blanket beside him. The interior temperature held steady at 65 degrees. The physics of survival operated with impartial precision during those 10 terrible days. Timber walls conduct heat at a predictable rate determined by the temperature differential between interior and exterior surfaces. When the outside temperature drops to 41 below zero and the interior target is 60 degrees, the differential exceeds 100 degrees. That differential drives heat outward through every surface continuously, requiring massive fuel consumption just to maintain equilibrium. Earth walls operate on different principles. 3 feet of packed soil does not conduct heat like timber. Instead, it absorbs thermal energy slowly and releases it slowly, acting as a buffer between interior comfort and exterior chaos. The earth stores warmth when the fire burns hot, then radiates that stored warmth back into the living space when the fire dies down. The mathematics favored Elias dramatically. His earth walls maintained a temperature of approximately 50 degrees at their inner surface, regardless of exterior conditions. The temperature differential his fire had to overcome was only 15 degrees rather than the 100+ degrees that timber cabins faced. He could burn 1/4 of the fuel and maintain twice the warmth. But survival was more than mathematics to Elias. It was inheritance. It was proof that his grandfather's wisdom had value. It was vindication of every lonely hour spent digging while the community laughed. Ingrid had reached the Earth Dome on the 3rd day, before the storm reached its peak intensity. Her father's cabin was failing, and she had remembered Elias's explanation of thermal mass and earth insulation. "My family's coming," she said as she stumbled through the entrance, ice crystals coating her eyelashes. "They are just behind me." The Lindqvist family arrived within the hour. Eric Lindqvist, the Swedish carpenter who had forbidden his daughter from visiting the orphan boy, entered the Earth Dome with humility written across his frozen features. "We were wrong," he said simply. "All of us were wrong." Elias nodded and gestured toward the fire. "Warm yourselves. There is room." By the 7th day, word had spread through networks of desperation. The Earth Dome held warmth. The Earth Dome could save lives. The Earth Dome was everything the orphan boy had promised and everyone had mocked. Klaus Weber arrived with his 85-year-old mother, the old woman barely conscious from exposure. Old Jacob Morrison came, nodding with grim satisfaction that his warnings had proven accurate. The Patterson family stumbled in, then the Caldwells, then a stream of others who had nowhere else to turn. Silas Hendricks arrived on the 7th day. The master builder had held out longer than most, convinced that his expertise would see his family through. But by January 22nd, denial had become impossible. His firewood was gone. His cabin temperature had dropped below 20 degrees. His youngest daughter Emma had not spoken in 2 days, her lips blue and her eyes vacant with the kind of absence that precedes death. Silas faced a choice that his pride had made nearly impossible. He could stay in his failing cabin and watch his family die. Or he could swallow 32 years of certainty, cross 300 yards of killing cold, and beg help from the boy he had mocked as a fool. Catherine Hendricks made the decision for him. "We are going to that Earth Dome," she said, her voice carrying more steel than Silas had ever heard from her. "You can come with us or you can freeze here alone. But I am not letting our children die because you are too proud to admit you were wrong." Silas looked at his children. Emma, 7, silent and blue. William Jr., 12, shaking uncontrollably. Margaret, 15, holding her youngest siblings with arms that trembled from cold rather than effort. Jacob, 17, the same age as the orphan boy who had built what Silas could not. Pride crumbled. Survival remained. "Get the ropes," Silas said quietly. "We're going to tie ourselves together. No one gets separated in this wind." The journey of 300 yards took 45 minutes. They couldn't see more than 10 feet in the driving snow. The wind pushed against them like a physical wall, forcing them to lean forward at steep angles just to make progress. Silas's beard turned white with frost within minutes. Ice formed on his eyebrows, his eyelashes, every surface of exposed skin. Emma stopped walking halfway there. Her legs simply gave out, and she crumpled into the snow with a soft sound that was almost immediately swallowed by the wind. Jacob, the oldest son, scooped up his little sister and carried her the rest of the way. His arms burned. His lungs screamed. But he didn't stop. The Earth Dome emerged from the blizzard like a mirage, a mound of snow-covered earth with a wooden door facing south, barely visible through the driving white chaos. Silas pounded on that door with fists that could barely feel the wood. The door opened. Warmth poured out. Elias Thornwood stood in the doorway, backlit by firelight, wearing nothing but a cotton shirt and work pants. Behind him, the Earth Dome glowed with heat and life. "Come in," Elias said. "All of you. There's room." Silas Hendricks stepped across that threshold and felt the warmth hit him like a physical force. After days of cold that reached into his bones, the sudden comfort was almost painful. His frozen clothing began to steam as ice crystals melted. His children stumbled past him, drawn toward the fire like moths toward flame. Emma Hendricks, 7 years old, silent for 3 days, looked around the warm Earth Dome with eyes that slowly regained their focus. Odin padded over to her and nuzzled her cold hand with his warm nose. The first words she had spoken since the cold descended came out as a whisper. "Can I pet the dog?" Elias knelt beside the little girl. "His name is Odin. He would like that very much." Emma's blue lips curved into the ghost of a smile. Her small fingers buried themselves in Odin's thick fur. The dog, with the instinct that his breed had developed over centuries of watching over Nordic children, settled himself beside her and let her draw warmth from his body. Silas Hendricks, master builder, watched his youngest daughter come back to life in the home he had called a grave. The weight of that realization pressed down on him like 3 feet of earth. The Earth Dome had been designed for one person. By January 25th, it held 31. Bodies pressed against bodies in the curved space. Adults sat with their backs against the warm earth walls. Children clustered near the small fire that burned at the center. Odin moved among the refugees, offering comfort with his presence, letting cold hands bury themselves in his thick fur. The mathematics of survival shifted again, this time in everyone's favor. 31 human bodies generated significant heat. That heat, added to the modest fire, raised the interior temperature and was absorbed by the massive earth walls. The walls stored it, held it, released it slowly back into the living space. The dome maintained temperatures between 62 and 68 degrees despite sheltering over 3 times its intended capacity. Elias moved among the refugees, explaining his grandfather's knowledge to anyone who would listen. "Feel the walls," he told Silas, guiding the older man's palm to the curved earth surface. "Warm to the touch. Even with 30 people and a small fire, the earth stores heat like a bank stores money. My grandfather said a properly built turf house could stay warm for 3 days after the fire died completely." Silas felt the warmth radiating from packed soil that he had dismissed as primitive foolishness. His hand trembled slightly and not from cold. "How did you know?" he asked. "You're 17 years old. How did you know something that I missed in 32 years? Elias shrugged. "I didn't know anything. My grandfather knew. His father knew. 1,000 years of people knew. I just listened." The Earth Dome became a crucible of enforced intimacy during those final days of the storm. Families that had lived as neighbors but never truly connected found themselves pressed together in the small space. Secrets emerged. Confessions flowed. The barriers that settlement life maintained between people crumbled in the shared experience of survival. Robert Whitmore admitted that his scientific certitude had been a mask for deeper insecurities. Dr. Holloway acknowledged that medicine could not heal everything, and that sometimes the old ways contained wisdom that modern training had overlooked. Reverend Caldwell led prayers that drew from multiple traditions, recognizing that God's wisdom flowed through many channels. Klaus Weber translated portions of Eric Thornwood's journal into English, reading aloud the accumulated knowledge of generations. The refugees listened in wonder to descriptions of Icelandic winters, far more severe than anything Carolina could produce, and the survival techniques that had allowed a small island nation to persist against impossible odds. Old Jacob Morrison told stories of the Cherokee Earth Lodge that had saved his life in 1856, adding his testimony to the accumulated evidence that traditional building methods held value that progress had carelessly discarded. Ingrid Lindqvist stayed close to Elias throughout those crowded days. Her father no longer objected. Eric Lindqvist had watched the young man he had forbidden his daughter from seeing save his entire family from freezing to death. Objections seemed rather small after that, but the most remarkable event of that terrible January occurred on the 10th day. Margaret Whitmore, wife of the surveyor, had been pregnant when the storm began. The stress and cold had complicated her condition, and by January 25th, her labor started 3 weeks early. The Earth Dome fell silent as Margaret's contractions began. 31 people held their breath while Dr. Holloway prepared to deliver a baby in circumstances he had never imagined facing. Outside, the temperature remained 35 degrees below zero. Inside, warmed by earth and fire and human hope, a child struggled toward life. The labor lasted 6 hours. Margaret screamed. Women who had borne children gathered around her with advice and comfort. Men retreated to the edges of the dome, giving the birthing space room while offering silent prayers. Odin, sensing the significance of what was happening, positioned himself near the entrance and stayed alert, as if guarding the sacred process from the chaos outside. At midnight on January 26th, a thin cry pierced the warm air of the Earth Dome. A girl, small but healthy, alive. Dr. Holloway placed the infant in Margaret's arms, his hands shaking with exhaustion and wonder. The baby squirmed and cried, protesting her entrance into a world that had tried so hard to freeze her out. "She needs a name," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. Robert Whitmore looked around the Earth Dome that had saved his family and allowed his daughter to be born. His eyes met Elias's across the crowded space. "Hope," he said. "Her name should be Hope." Elias nodded slowly. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory. The Earth Dome is where life is protected. Now he understood what those words truly meant. 31 people, 1 newborn baby, and 1 faithful dog, all of them alive in a shelter that everyone had called a grave. If that isn't proof that the old ways carry wisdom we should never forget, I don't know what is. The storm broke on January 27th. Dawn arrived with something that the refugees had almost forgotten existed. Silence. The wind had finally stopped. The temperature, while still well below zero, had risen to a level that no longer qualified as immediately fatal. Elias opened the door of the Earth Dome and stepped outside for the first time in days. The world had transformed. Snow drifts rose higher than rooftops. Trees had shattered, their frozen limbs scattered across the white landscape like broken bones. Nothing moved. Nothing lived. The settlement looked like a photograph of the aftermath of some terrible battle. One by one, the refugees emerged from the Earth Dome and surveyed the destruction. Silas Hendrick's cabin had partially collapsed. The timber walls, stressed beyond their design limits by the sustained cold, had buckled inward on the north side. Snow had invaded through gaps that the wind had torn in the chinking. Robert Whitmore's precise construction had fared little better. His roof had developed gaps where ice had formed and expanded, compromising the structural integrity. Throughout the settlement, the story repeated itself. Timber cabins had failed. Only the mound of earth rising from the hillside, the structure that everyone had mocked as primitive foolishness, had maintained its integrity. The count took 3 days. 4 people dead in Haywood County alone. The Henderson baby, Samuel Crawford, Grandmother Williams, and young Thomas. 4 lives lost to the cold that everyone had believed their timber cabins could withstand. Across 4 counties, the toll reached 67 dead. Men frozen trying to reach their barns. Women who ran out of fuel and couldn't survive the trip to gather more. Children whose small bodies simply couldn't fight the cold. Elderly residents whose hearts gave out under the strain. 67 lives lost and 31 lives saved. Every person who had reached Elias Thornwood's Earth Dome had survived, including one who had been born there, entering the world in the only structure in the county that could sustain new life. The community gathering happened on the first Sunday of February, after the roads had been cleared and travel was possible again. The small church filled beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and crowded into the doorway. Everyone wanted to hear what Silas Hendricks had to say. The master builder walked to the front of the church slowly, his shoulders bearing a weight that had nothing to do with the cold. He turned to face the congregation, and when he spoke, his voice trembled. "I have built 58 cabins in these mountains," Silas began. 32 years of work, 32 years of believing I knew everything about construction in mountain country. He paused, gathering himself. "I called Elias Thornwood a fool. I said he was building his own grave. I told everyone in this settlement to let him fail, to let him learn that the old ways had been abandoned for good reason." Silas's voice cracked. "Every cabin I built would have killed its occupants if this winter had lasted another 2 weeks. Every single one. The timber walls, the peaked roofs, the chinking in the fireboxes. All of it failed. All of my expertise, all of my experience, all of my certainty failed." He turned to look directly at Elias, who stood near the back of the church with Odin at his feet. And that boy, 17 years old, orphaned 3 times before he became a man. That boy built the only structure in this county that could keep people alive. He built it with his own hands while we laughed at him. He opened his door when we came begging for shelter. He saved my children's lives after I told the whole settlement that he was a fool. Silas's tears fell openly now, frozen tracks on weathered cheeks. "I was wrong. We were all wrong. And I will spend whatever years I have left learning what that boy's grandfather knew, because clearly there is wisdom in this world that my experience never touched." The church fell silent. Robert Whitmore rose next. "My scientific assessment was incomplete. I evaluated the structure using principles that did not account for thermal mass or earth insulation. The boy's design represented sophisticated engineering that I failed to recognize because it looked different from what I expected. I apologize for my arrogance." Dr. Holloway stood. "I predicted disease and respiratory illness. Instead, I delivered a healthy baby in the cleanest air I have ever experienced in a mountain shelter. My medical training provided no basis for understanding what that Earth Dome accomplished. I apologize for my ignorance." Reverend Caldwell approached the pulpit. "I expressed concerns about pagan traditions and Christian appropriateness. I have since reflected on this matter with considerable prayer. God created the earth. God gave humans the wisdom to use what he created. There is nothing unchristian about building with materials that God provided. I apologize for my narrow vision." Billy Tanner walked to the front of the church last. The young man who had thrown bottles and placed bets against the orphan boy reached into his pocket and withdrew $5. He didn't speak. He simply walked to where Elias stood, pressed the money into his hand, and shook his head slowly. "I was a fool," Billy said quietly. "You weren't. Spring came late that year, as if the land needed time to recover from the assault of January. Silas Hendricks became Elias's first student. The master builder who had dismissed earth construction as primitive foolishness spent March and April learning the principles that Eric Thornwood's journal contained. "Show me again how the ventilation works," Silas would say, studying diagrams that now seemed like revelation rather than madness. "The channels here and here," Elias explained patiently. "Fresh air enters low, passes near the heat source, rises as it warms, exits high. Continuous circulation without losing the heated air to the outside." Silas added an earth-bermed addition to his rebuilt cabin that summer. The technique spread from there. Klaus Weber helped translate the complete journal into English, creating copies that could be shared throughout the settlement. The accumulated wisdom of Icelandic generations became available to anyone willing to learn. By 1900, 12 earth-sheltered structures stood in Haywood County. By 1915, the number had grown to 23. The technique spread through networks of Scandinavian and German immigrants who recognized their own ancestral knowledge in the designs. Not everyone adopted the methods. Some remained skeptical. Some preferred the familiarity of timber construction despite its limitations. But no one ever again called earth-building foolishness. Not in Haywood County. Elias and Ingrid married in the summer of 1895. Eric Lindqvist gave his blessing without hesitation. "Any man who saves 31 lives deserves my daughter," he told Elias at the wedding. "Any man who saves them using knowledge that everyone mocked deserves my respect as well." They expanded the Earth Dome, adding rooms as their family grew. 3 children eventually played in spaces carved from the hillside, warmed by walls that their great-great-grandfather had first described in his worn leather journal. Their eldest son, Eric, named for both grandfathers, became an architect who specialized in earth-sheltered construction. He designed 17 homes across the Appalachian region, each one incorporating the principles his father had learned from a worn leather journal. Their daughter Astrid, named for the grandmother she never knew, became a teacher who told the story of the great Arctic outbreak to generations of students. Their youngest, William, farmed the 40 acres that his father had refused to sell, passing the land down through 4 more generations. Old Jacob Morrison lived to see the transformation. He died peacefully in 1902, at the age of 77, having witnessed the vindication of everything he had tried to warn people about since that terrible winter of 1856. Klaus Weber passed in 1903, content that the Erdhouse wisdom of his Bavarian grandfather had found new life in the Carolina mountains. Odin lived to be 14 years old. The Icelandic sheepdog who had watched his master dig, who had growled at skeptics and comforted survivors, who had let a frozen little girl bury her hands in his thick fur during the darkest hours of a killing winter. That faithful companion closed his amber eyes for the final time in 1904, curled up beside the Earth Dome's central hearth. Elias buried him on the hillside, just above the home they had built together. The grave marker was simple. Odin, faithful friend. He witnessed everything. 1890, 1904. Elias visited that grave every evening for the rest of his life. He would sit beside the small stone and speak quietly to the dog who had been his only companion during the loneliest months of his youth. "Grandfather sent you to watch over me," Elias would say. "You and the journal. Both of you saved my life. Both of you made everything possible." Elias Thornwood lived to be 83 years old. He died peacefully in the summer of 1960, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the same Earth Dome he had built as a desperate 17-year-old orphan. His final words, according to family legend, were the same words his grandfather had spoken to him 66 years earlier. "The earth will save you when everything else fails. Remember that. Always remember that." In 1978, researchers from the University of Tennessee conducted a formal study of earth-sheltered construction techniques used in the Appalachian region. They built replica structures using the original Thornwood specifications, measuring thermal performance against period timber construction under simulated extreme conditions. The results confirmed what 31 survivors had learned firsthand in January of 1895. The Earth Dome design achieved 3.8 times greater heating efficiency than conventional timber cabins. It maintained temperature advantages of 25 to 40 degrees, even under extreme conditions. The thermal mass provided retention equivalent to 14 hours of active heating. The Appalachian Folk Heritage Center now maintains records from 7 Earth Dome structures built using Thornwood specifications between 1895 and 1915. These records include detailed construction drawings, thermal performance measurements, and fuel consumption data. The original Thornwood Earth Dome still stands. It was designated a historical landmark in 1962 and has been carefully preserved as an example of frontier innovation and ancestral wisdom applied to American conditions. Modern visitors can tour the structure and feel the same warmth that saved 31 lives during the worst winter in Blue Ridge memory. Guides explain the physics that a 17-year-old orphan understood intuitively and that experts with decades of experience had completely missed. We have reached the end of this story, but perhaps you are wondering what the final lesson might be. There are many lessons in what happened in Haywood County during the winter of 1894 to 1895. Lessons about humility, about the value of ancestral knowledge, about the danger of dismissing what we don't understand, about the courage required to admit we were wrong. But perhaps the most important lesson is this: never laugh at someone who does things differently than everyone else. They may know something you haven't learned yet. They may remember something you have forgotten. And someday, When the cold comes and everything you trusted fails, they may be the only ones who can save your life. Elias Thornwood was called a fool for building a house of earth. He was mocked for trusting ancient wisdom over modern expertise. He was dismissed as a madman for believing that his grandfather's knowledge had value in a new world. And when the killing cold descended, when timber cabins became coffins and fires couldn't hold back the frost, that fool's earth dome was the only place in Haywood County where life could survive. Sometimes the people everyone calls crazy are the only ones who are sane. Sometimes the knowledge everyone dismisses as primitive is the only knowledge that works when everything else fails. And sometimes, the 17-year-old orphan with nothing but a journal and a dog understands something that experts with decades of experience have completely missed. Remember that. The next time you hear someone laughed at for doing things differently, the next time you see knowledge dismissed because it seems old or strange or primitive, remember Elias Thornwood. Remember the Earth Dome. Remember 31 lives saved and one life born in a structure that everyone called a grave. And remember that sometimes the wisdom we need most desperately is the wisdom we have most thoroughly forgotten. If this story touched something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has been mocked for being different. Share it with someone who keeps ancestral knowledge alive in a world that doesn't always value the old ways. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that expertise isn't everything. That experience can blind us as easily as it enlightens us. That somewhere, right now, someone is being laughed at for knowing something that everyone else has forgotten. And that someday, we might all be grateful they remembered. The end.